Senator Jeff Bingaman came to the Freedom, New Mexico offices Wednesday. We asked him about filibusters, health care, and the upcoming election. Here are some of the things Senator Bingaman had to say.
I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay. You're on recess. Basically, once you come back September 13th, what are some things that you and the Congress like to get done in the last few months?
Well, we've got a lot we should get done when we go back into session. I hope we're able to. There's been a lot of polarization and partisanship in the Senate here in recent weeks and months, so it's been difficult. But one item that was an unfinished item is a small business tax package, which is intended to help small businesses, also to provide additional some tax incentives for accelerated depreciation of equipment that they purchase, for example. It increases the amounts that the Small Business Administration can guarantee in the way of loans to small business. There's also in there a $30 billion taken from the funds that were made available through the stimulus package that then is made available to healthy community banks on the condition that they loan that out in order to stimulate more lending to small business. So that's one package that needs to be done. I hope we're able to do it. Obviously, we also have to pass the appropriations bills to keep the federal government operating. I hope we can do that when we come back in September. If not, that will have to be something we deal with in the so-called lame duck session, which is expected to happen after the election occurs.
All right. And how frustrating has it been to push legislation through, since it seems you need to get 60 votes to do almost anything? For instance, before you went to break, there was an energy and oil spill legislation that you guys haven't been able to get to.
Yeah, well, that's another item I hope very much we can get to when we go back into session. It's been frustrating. There's no question about that. I think some of the opposition may be based on the merits of the legislation being put forward. Unfortunately, I fear a lot of the opposition really does probably amount to obstruction, in the sense that there's a desire not to see additional legislation passed, or not to see the president sign any additional legislation of consequence between now and the election. So whatever the motivations are, it's been very difficult to get agreement on legislation in the Senate.
Okay, and how much of that is at the feet of Republicans? They've invoked a record number of cloture. And how much of that is the feet of the Democratic membership for not having the same unity on legislation? That bill I was talking about a while ago, you have two senators, Begich and Landrieu. They oppose a liability cap change that's in the oil spill bill. President Bush had never had more than 55 senators, and he never really had to seem to have a problem getting stuff through the Senate. So basically, how much is it at one party or at another party? How much is it at the feet of Republicans? How much is it at the feet of the Democratic membership?
Well, I'm sure you'll get a different answer to that depending on who you ask. From my perspective, to take the one specific you asked about, the energy bill itself, there were two Democratic senators who had problems with the liability cap, the elimination of the cap on liability in the oil spill legislation that Senator Reid proposed, but they have worked out a way to amend that, change it so that it would be acceptable to them, and I think acceptable to most members as far as I know. So that was not the real opposition. The real opposition was a more generic unwillingness to move ahead with energy legislation at this stage in the congressional calendar. So I think there has been fairly entrenched opposition by the Republican minority to a lot of what needed to be done. I was listening to an interview yesterday on the radio with our ambassador to Iraq, Chris Hill, and it reminded me of how many months we had to struggle to get the Republicans to let us bring up and vote the confirmation of Chris Hill as our ambassador. He's now about to retire in another month, but he is a very respected Foreign Service officer, has had a very distinguished career in the State Department through Democratic and Republican administrations, had been our ambassador to Korea. There was no reason in the world he shouldn't have been approved readily to be our ambassador to Iraq once the president nominated him, but there was just an unwillingness to cooperate, an unwillingness to go along, and so it took months to do what should have happened very quickly.
All right, and as part of a remedy, Senator Udall has been pushing possibly for the next session of Congress to have new rules and not abide by the previous rules of previous sessions, requiring simple majority votes instead of allowing for 41 senators to defeat bills via cloture votes and via filibusters. Are you a supporter of Senator Udall's efforts?
Well, I think he has not gotten into the weeds as far as the detail of what changes he would want to see brought about, but I would certainly support changing some of the rules that we operate under. For example, you have to have 60 votes not only to pass a bill, you have to close off debate and pass a bill, you have to have 60 votes to proceed to a bill, and then you have to have 60 votes again to actually close off debate and pass the bill. I don't see why we should have to have 60 votes to proceed to consider legislation. It seems to me that it would be much better if we could make that change in the rules as an example.
Okay. And how do you get some of the others on the board with you and Senator Udall? Like for example, Scott Brown is pretty powerful because he'll sometimes come across an aisle. Ben Nelson, Collins, Snow, they gain a lot of power just by being that one potential vote that could swing something. And they would lose that if it just goes to a simple majority vote. How do you get those guys on board?
Well, of course, the fall election will reshuffle the cards, and we'll have a very different membership coming to the Senate to be sworn in January. So this idea that we've got these 2 or 3 senators who are swing votes and always able to determine whether we have the 60 votes or not, that may not be the case in the new Congress. It's very likely that it will not be. So they may look at it very differently once we get past this election.
All right, and speaking of the election, you wrote a wave to an easy victory. There was a wave election in 2006, and a similar wave helped Tom Udall ascend from the House. Are you glad you're not up for re-election in the current political climate where the first-term president generally loses votes in Houses and Congress?
No question. I'm glad I'm not running this year. I think it's anyone who is in office is probably feels the same way if they're not, in fact, on the ballot this fall.
What's your advice to senators and representatives who are?
Well, my advice is to do what they can to make the case for the direction the country needs to be moving in, and I think we've got a strong case to make that we've been taking actions to move the country in the right direction. The biggest issue, I think, weighing on our upcoming election is the economy, and there's no question that people are very frustrated and upset about the high unemployment, the slow growth in our economy. Clovis has been saved from much of that because of the growth out here at Cannon Air Force Base, which has been a very good thing for the economy in this part of the state. But many parts of our state and throughout the rest of the country are not as fortunate, and until we can get the economy moving again, and until we can begin creating significant numbers of jobs each month, there's going to be a lot of frustration and anxiety, and it's understandable.
All right. And some of the things that you've been working on, obviously there's the Ute Water Project. We ask you about that pretty much every time you're here. What's your feeling on the status of the Ute Water Project, and what kind of appropriation would you like to get together next time you put legislation through on it?
Well, we've got, I believe, $10 million set aside for the Ute Water Project to go ahead with the rest of the design activity on that, and I think that's a step in the right direction. There is going to be a need for us to appropriate significant funds each year for the next several years once we get into actual construction of that project. But I think we're moving in the right direction, and the fact that we're able to get that $10 million was good. I think the administration, of course, will send us a new budget in January, and they will specify how much they would like to see us appropriate in this area. I hope it is at least the $10 million that we are hoping to appropriate this year.
And would it likely be in an omnibus bill as well?
Well, I believe that the $10 million would be rolled into an omnibus bill if we're able to do that.
Okay. And one item that we were actually talking about that didn't go through the cloture votes because it ended up going through reconciliation was health care legislation. What do you think were the positives and negatives of the legislation that you guys were able to pass?
Well, I think that overall it's a very substantial positive for the country and particularly for us in New Mexico, because I do think it will get us started on containing the growth and the cost of health care. It doesn't do everything that we should do there, but it does begin to help us in that regard. It extends the solvency of Medicare by an extra 12 years, according to the trustees of the Medicare system. It provides a lot of insurance reforms, which were very much overdue, in my opinion, where insurance companies cannot rescind a person's policy when the person gets sick or comes down with cancer or something. It also requires that there be coverage even if a person has a pre-existing condition. We've had this perverse system in place for a long time now in this country, where insurance companies essentially can cherry pick who's going to be eligible to buy their insurance, and if you're sick, you don't qualify, so you don't get insurance. So there are a lot of reforms. Also, it expands coverage to a lot of folks who currently don't have any coverage. There are a lot of working families in this country who make too much money to get their coverage through Medicaid, but who are not able to afford the cost of insurance. And under this medical reform, we provide assistance to people based on their ability to buy that insurance, so that everybody can get insurance. And many of these reforms don't take effect till 2014, but they do start as early as this year.
And do you have any fears that 2012 comes around, maybe employment still is in double figures, it might make Barack Obama a one-term president, the Republican nominee comes in and repeals parts or all of the health care, including things that don't take effect till 2014? Do you have any concerns on that type of situation?
Well, I don't think that's likely, because first, I think President Obama will be reelected. But second, I think the health care legislation, the more people understand about it, the more they, I think, would oppose the idea of repealing it. There still are candidates who are running for office around the country who are running on a platform that they would get elected to the Congress and vote to repeal the health care reform bill. But I think the more informed they get about some of the benefits that their constituents are receiving, I think the less likely it is that the Congress would seriously consider a repeal, or that a future president would seriously consider a repeal.
And while Obama's in office, it would, of course, take a two-thirds majority.
Yeah, I'm certain he would not support any kind of repeal. But even if he were not there, I think the Congress would most likely not support it either.
Okay. Anything else that you'd like to address before we close out?
Can't think of it. Thanks for talking with me. Nice to be in Clovis.
Reporting for Freedom New Mexico, I'm Kevin Wilson.